Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Now more than ever, independent media needs the support of listeners and viewers. Visit the website aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast and gain access to the bonus content. There are both audio and video versions of the show that you can find on the various platforms. You can find that on the website. And in most cases, the video version has some images, maps, clips, and things that enhance the content. Our guest today is Alex Krainer. After 2 years of pandemic response, there are some new and interesting perspectives of the Theranos case. We discuss Alex Krainer's 3-part article titled Theranos Scandal, The Real Story. And in a bonus episode, we talk about how world wars have led to great resets in the past, and whether our current situation signals that preparations for world-changing wars are being made right now. Alex Krainer has an impressive and a multifaceted background that positions him to look at this case from a new angle. He's a market analyst, a researcher, a futures trader, an investor, an author, and a former hedge fund manager, and he's based in Monaco. He was born in Yugoslavia, lived through the hyperinflation in the 1980s there. He went to university abroad in the United States and Switzerland, and then he worked in Venezuela, where he experienced his first banking crisis when 9 of Venezuela's 16 largest banks failed, brought the country's economy to a grinding halt. Then he returned to his native Croatia, and he served in the military during the last phases of Croatia's war for independence. And from there he moved to Monaco to work in the oil trading business. He rose to the level of CEO, having built an R&D unit specializing in market analysis, neural networks, and artificial intelligence in trading financial and commodities markets. He developed something called iSystem Strategies, launched his own high-performing investment management business, and he managed units of other firms. Alex is also an author of finance-related books and professional papers, including one titled Mastering Uncertainty in Commodities Trading, and that was ranked #1 book on financialexpert.co.uk list of the 5 best commodities books for investors and traders. He also wrote Commodity Price Risks, Profits, and Value Creation, and Alex Krainer's Trend Following Bible. And then in 2017, he published a book based on his own investigation of Bill Browder. And the book's titled Grand Deception, The Truth About Bill Browder, the Magnitsky Act, and Anti-Russian Sanctions. The book was then targeted by Jonathan Weiner, the former policy advisor for Secretary of State John Kerry in the Obama administration. And Amazon deleted his account and the reviews. They didn't pay his royalties since 2018, but they kept the book on the Amazon site at these hugely inflated prices, while I guess keeping the money, until just last week when Amazon removed the books from the website altogether without any explanation. And so here's the interview. Alex Krainer is here. I'm so happy to meet you, Alex. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure, Joanne. Greetings to you and to your listeners everywhere in the world.
So I've been following your work I was trying to figure it out, 3 or 4 years, probably around the time that you wrote the Grand Deception book.
Okay.
And but this is actually the first time we've talked. We've chatted, like with all sort of online acquaintances and friends and colleagues. It's to the point now where you really feel like you know somebody, but you actually haven't even met them on a Zoom call. You've just, talked. So I'm just glad that we're finally getting to talk. There are a million things I would like to talk to you about. And I have to warn you already that I hope that you'll come back because I know we won't be able to cover all of them in one episode.
Absolutely, with pleasure. Yes.
And so there's a series of articles that Alex wrote about Theranos that really was an eye-opener for me, having not really followed that story very much. but the story as you told it, and then the conclusions that you drew were really, it was like a real bombshell, in my opinion. We're also going to try to talk a little bit about the Russiagate developments and some insights that Alex has on that. And then I'd like to talk, I guess, probably in our bonus segment, we're going to talk about the Great Reset, although things about the Great Reset are going to be woven all through this conversation because it's so central to everything right now. But I want to talk about the Great Reset and Empire in the bonus episode and get as many of your insights as we can. And then, we'll just let the conversation go where it does. But first off, and I'll link all of these stories, and all of the relevant links will be in the show notes for everybody. But let's start out talking about your analysis on the Theranos situation.
Very well. Okay. Would you like me to start from the beginning, or is there a specific question that you have?
Yeah, let's do just a little bit of background for anybody who may not have followed the story. And then let's get into the investors and the board members. So who is behind this project? Maybe how the factions sort out. And then we'll follow that with a question about what your theory is on what that Theranos technology really was and what it was intended, the mission that it was intended to accomplish, and why it didn't. So let's just start out with a little bit of background on what the Theranos project was, when it started, and who was behind it.
Okay, very well. So, I came across Theranos for the first time. I suppose it must have been 2014, 2015. I was working at a hedge fund company, as I was managing a portfolio there, and all of us portfolio managers, we were kind of following the news, doing our research, analyzing what's going on in the world is a major part of that job. So obviously Theranos came up as a news item. And so at some point they must have launched a PR campaign where suddenly you read about Theranos everywhere. There was this brilliant young inventor, entrepreneur, Elizabeth Holmes, who started the whole thing, invented this amazing technology for diagnosing something like 200 different illnesses, 200 different blood tests. And from just one drop of blood through this miniature machine that looked like a desktop, like an upright desktop computer. And so, well, I don't know much about this, but I found the thing. She founded the company in 2003. She was 19. That she invented this amazing thing, I was a little bit skeptical. I kind of got used to this understanding that this PR machinery can sometimes exaggerate the stories so much that they distort them out of all proportion. But in a way, I understood that as a way to sell a business to investors. And once you're on Bloomberg TV, once you're on CNBC, most likely you got there because you paid a powerful PR agency who then says, like, okay, today you're going to CNBC, tomorrow you're going to talk to Maria Bartiromo, the next day you're going to have an interview with Charlie Rose, whatever. So I thought like, okay, so there we got some spin. But then I looked into this.
Interrupt you for a quick second?
Sure,
So
yeah.
You've been in the technology arena, as I have,
Yes,
as
correct.
well. So we're very aware of smoke and mirrors, vaporware, this kind of thing. But at that point in time, there were amazing things going on, right, in the tech realm. I mean, were the opportunities were just, unimaginable almost. So you could see how it may have been easier to get away with it at that point.
Yeah, absolutely, no doubt about it. And there's always that going on. It's just that you may never find out. There may be some amazingly inventive innovating, creating guys and girls working in their garages, putting together phenomenal things, but they're not going to get discovered so easily. And then once they are on CNBC, on Bloomberg TV, on like on all these stages around the world, once they're very highly visible, almost invariably it's because they're already in the capital markets machinery and they're being pushed forward by the powerful PR agency. This is already public relations at work. It's not that Charlie Rose goes out. Well, he doesn't. He's off the scene now. But it's not like Maria Bartiromo goes around the world and tries to find these genius inventors. It's the PR agencies who come to them and who say like, okay, tomorrow we're going to interview such and such person, but that such and such person is already very well funded.
Right.
They already have, it's at that stage, my perception was that this is already in the machine. So I was skeptical, but I kind of thought that, okay, so this is a spin to get investors on board, to push up the valuation of the company higher. But then when I looked at the company and I looked into their board of directors, that's where I kind of was taken aback, because suddenly this young girl who is in some kind of a health technology business, she's got Henry Kissinger on the board of directors. She's got George Shultz.
Well, that's a bad sign right there. That's a giant red flag, the fact that Kissinger's there.
Yeah, exactly. And so the whole entire board of directors were deep state actors. They were like some of the most powerful people in the world, and none of them had anything to do with healthcare.
Right.
So I thought, how would you get all these people on your board of directors? There's something else going on. This is not just a plain vanilla health technology company. Something else is going on. I couldn't tell what was going on, but I kind of suspected, like maybe something to do with diagnostics, in the way that they could then sell healthcare products, pharmaceutical products, like ways, you give your drop of blood, and then they tell you, you have to go and do chemotherapy, or you have to take this medicine, or you have to take that vaccine. So I kind of suspected it was something like that. And then it was only when the pandemic happened at the beginning of 2020 that I realized that this was connected. And then my suspicions were confirmed when Bill Gates came out in January of this year, 2021, and he was talking about how to prevent the next pandemic. And he was talking about these mega testing facilities where they would have this diagnostic technology that could quickly and cheaply test a large segment of the population, something I think he said like 20% of the population per week, that they could
What?
Yeah, he literally, there's that video is still up online.
We all want to return to the way things were before COVID-19, but there's one area where I hope we never go back: our complacency about pandemics. We can get ahead of infectious disease outbreaks. By the next pandemic, I believe we can have what I call mega testing diagnostic platforms. They can be deployed quickly, cost very little, and test 20% of the entire population every week. We also want to get treatments out far faster next time. One of the most promising is monoclonal antibodies. These manufactured antibodies grab onto the virus and disable it, just like your immune system, and can reduce death rates by as much as 80%. I also think that we'll develop new vaccines quickly, in large part due to this new mRNA platform. mRNA will become faster to develop, easier to store, and lower cost. That's a huge breakthrough. To stop future pandemics quickly, we need to be able to spot disease outbreaks as soon as they happen anywhere in the world. And that requires a global alert system. If there turns out to be some new infectious pathogen, then we need a group of infectious disease responders to spring into action. Think of these as like pandemic firefighters. They're going to use their logistics, use their ability to build up capacity quickly. They're going to go wherever that problem is. Stopping the next pandemic will require a big investment. But I think of this as the best insurance policy the world could buy. You can read more about this in our annual letter.
And then I realized that this is probably what Theranos was, because otherwise the whole thing doesn't make any sense at all. You know, like, why would these? First, it was obvious that Theranos technology didn't work at all. Yet they somehow kept up the deception for 12 years, right? From 2003 until it started to unravel in October of 2015, when Wall Street Journal's John Carreiro published his article about Theranos, and then it kind of came out, and then you couldn't put the genie back into the bottle again. And so this whole technology didn't work. It was well understood by the insiders that it didn't work, yet they nevertheless pushed it forward very hard. It became clear that George Shultz was former state secretary in Ronald Reagan's administration, thoroughly a deep state actor, a swamp creature, and he had very hands-on role in Theranos, not in the day-to-day management, but he was the gray eminence behind Elizabeth Holmes. He and Don Lucas Sr., who was one of the most prominent venture capitalists in the Silicon Valley. So Don Lucas Sr. had weekly lunches with Elizabeth Holmes. Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, was present very frequently in those meetings. So apparently, between those three, they had the most active roles. They were coaching Elizabeth Holmes. They were telling her probably. I mean, I don't know, but I suspect that they were kind of directing her. She was just the front woman. And another interesting thing is that Don Lucas Sr. didn't do anything by email. So he did not accept emails. He did not receive emails. He did not send emails. And if there were documents, contracts, agreements to be discussed, they had to be brought to him, printed out in hard copy. Nothing was to go by electronic mail. And so, my contention, it was intended as an information weapon. And in that case, to these people, it didn't matter whether the technology worked or not. So the claim was that Elizabeth Holmes' mini analyzers could could perform over 200 different blood tests from just a drop of blood, which people who have actual experience with this, with blood testing technologies, will tell you this is absolutely impossible, right? And so Theranos machines could perform only 15 of those claimed 200 tests, and even those 15, they were not accurate. They were not reliable. And so for people who invested over $750 million into this business and staked their reputations on it, over a 12-year period, they had ample time to realize that this is not going to work out. Nevertheless, what they did is they pushed it forward anyway, aggressively, and they even very proactively, aggressively ran a campaign of intimidation and against all the potential whistleblowers. So, on the one hand, they were pushing the company and its faulty technology forward. On the other hand, they were very keen that the truth about it doesn't come out. And for me, this was extremely strange, because these very powerful people, these very wealthy individuals who also had their own reputations at stake here, that they would do something like that, and why. And I mean, like this is not even in their domain of expertise. So there had to be a very strong reason why they would do something like this, because it's incredibly reckless. It's incredibly adventurous for some. Like when Theranos was launched, George Shultz was already in his 80s with a very distinguished career behind him. Why was he so keen
Right.
on this Theranos thing? And so I finally put it together with the pandemic and with this Bill Gates's presentation from January 2021, that this was intended as an information weapon. Basically, I think that what they envisioned is that they would have this technology, distributed everywhere around the world through these chains of pharmacies like Walgreens, like Safeway, CVS, and what have you, Boots in England, and like in every country they could replicate the same franchise worldwide. And then these blood analyzers were all connected via the internet to the headquarters, I guess, of Theranos in Silicon Valley, where the results would come from. So I guess the information obtained from the analysis would be interpreted from their central server, and then the results would be reported back, right?
Right.
So in this way, they could remotely trigger outbreaks of epidemics wherever they wanted. They could say like, okay, let's have an outbreak in London, let's have an outbreak in Beijing, let's have an outbreak in Russia. And if their technology was not questioned and scrutinized independently, then they could get away with it, right? They could just say like, oh my God, like we have an epidemic of XYZ disease in this place, and now we have to go in and prevent this epidemic from spreading, and then intervene however they would choose to intervene. They could maybe put political pressure on leaders in countries that they didn't like. They could destabilize countries in this way, and they could, as they did, declare a global pandemic and then say like, okay, now everybody has to distance, wear masks, stop going to work, shut down the schools, mandate vaccines, mandate vaccine passports, and so forth. So it's with Bill Gates's presentation that it became clear to me that this is what it probably was intended to be. This is the only explanation that can kind of square these powerful deep state actors being so heavily invested in some technology that had nothing to do with what they've been doing all of their lives. And so this is why I found the story incredibly interesting. But then as I researched into it, what I found even more interesting is the way it fell apart. Because I think that these Theranos analyzers were meant to be driving the information war on humanity for this current pandemic. I think that
Basically
this
by
is what
controlling the case numbers, the case numbers and locations, which we,
exactly.
watch. Just look what just happened over the past couple of years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, unlike the PCR tests, which were then turned out to be their plan B, PCR tests are understood by many people in the healthcare industry, and they were able to explain it to the rest of us, what the PCR is, how it works, the thing with the cycles and the replications and the polymerase enzymes and so forth. All of these things were able, the experts were able to explain it to the rest of us how exactly this works. Well, if the diagnostics technology was closed in a box that was intellectual property belonging to Theranos.
And you're saying that you said that even the investors were not allowed to know anything about that technology? It was all
Yeah,
understood.
apparently even the investors were not allowed to question the technology or ask about it. And Elizabeth Holmes herself was being pretty brazen. She would say like, well, if you don't like those terms, then I walk, because she felt that she was so in demand and so, like the next Google, the next Facebook, that investors would just have to go along with her terms, and many did. But the point being that if somebody questioned the test results, then they could always say like, oh well, this is private intellectual property, we cannot disclose this. Just like they do with the vaccines now, that like they're administering the vaccines, but
Right.
the inserts are blank sheets of paper, and they say we cannot disclose this. This is until this is protected property. So
At
you're
least
just going to
parts of
have
it
to
are
trust it.
redacted. Yeah.
Yeah. So they,
agreements.
like you're just going to have to trust us, and they would do the same thing with these test results. So the effect being that they could invent, at a flick of a switch, they could invent a new epidemic or a new pandemic, and they could say, oh, it's this thing. Look, our technology will diagnose it quickly, cheaply. Everybody go get a test, and then they're going to tell you, okay, so many people tested positive, and then whatever the World Health Organization says that has to be done, we would be obliged to do. Now, because Theranos fell apart, they had to go back to plan B, which was PCR test. And that is not protected intellectual property. That's a known entity. And this is why now the PCR test is one of the main exhibits in the prosecution efforts that are being currently mounted by Dr. Rainer Fulmich and the team of lawyers that collaborate with him. The centerpiece of that is the PCR test, and so this was a major failure for these powerful people, because the technology and the company that was so extremely keen on fell apart in spite of their most earnest effort to protect it. Even after it was outed, George Shultz, General Mattis, they all remained committed. They all continued to defend Theranos. Walgreens, which had a major deal with Theranos, stayed on board for another 7 months. So Theranos fraud was outed in October 2015. I think that the deal, the joint venture between Theranos and Walgreens was finally it finally unraveled at some point mid 2016. So they, like all these people carried on the fraud, hoping to somehow salvage it way past its due date. And I think that's a beautiful case study where you had a fraudulent a company based on fraudulent technology, backed by some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world. One of the biggest investor was the owner of Wall Street Journal, Rupert Murdoch. But then there was the Walton family, there was the Betsy DeVos family, there was Larry Ellison, Don Lucas Sr., Tim Draper, another one of the most prominent Silicon Valley venture capitalists. So these were extremely powerful people who invested a very large amount of money into Theranos. They had very powerful public relations companies on their side. Elizabeth Holmes was projected and celebrated as the greatest thing since ever. The youngest female self-made billionaire, brilliant inventor. They were trying very hard to portray her as somebody who's brilliant and successful in business, but also also had a big heart. They would literally be saying things like this because she was doing it all not for money, but because she wanted to, quote unquote, democratize diagnostics to help people improve their health, save people's lives, and so forth. And so by some point in 2014, this all reached the peak where, the company valuation rose to $9 billion. A company that never made any money. It was making huge losses, right? It was valued $9 billion in private deals. It was not on the stock market yet. Elizabeth Holmes was everywhere. They had these very, very powerful law firm, Boyce Schiller, pursuing potential whistleblowers, disgruntled employees, employees who were fired or resigned, to make sure that they don't speak out, that they don't disclose anything. They were very, very aggressive, very nasty. And so this all seemed invincible, with powerful deep state actors backing the company. And with all that money and with all that power and with all that media and PR glitz and glamour, it fell apart nevertheless. And it fell apart essentially because 5 or 6 of Theranos employees and one journalist wouldn't keep quiet about it. And so they refused to be intimidated. They refused to be paid off and keep their silence. And instead they spoke out, and it all unraveled in spite of everything that they try to do to salvage it. And so I think that for the reason why I find this extremely encouraging is because we are now living a much larger version of Theranos, namely a fraudulent agenda that's being pushed forward by extremely powerful people who have seemingly infinite resources. The media are on their side, the public relations are on their side, the law enforcement is on their side. They have successfully intimidated and paralyzed the court system. Nobody dares to go against them, but nevertheless, I think the truth will come out. The truth is coming out. There are people who refuse to be intimidated among us. There are people who refuse to be silent. And I think that ultimately the agenda will unravel. I think it will inevitably unravel.
I have a couple threads I want to pull on there. So the one is maybe the scariest for me. Theranos started in 2003. Now, I get, it's possible that, and of course it had these very powerful backers from the start. I guess it's possible that the intention for how this technology would be used, maybe it wasn't from the start intended to be this sort of case data generator and controller that it looks like it turned into later. But we also have things like these simulations like Dark Winter and all the ones that followed after that were also being done in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
So this is just your opinion. Do you think that the intention and I guess I should also mention that, there have been a lot of presentations and white papers and this and that around the health surveillance issue, mass surveillance of health issues with military and DARPA involvement, things like that. And that's not new either. That's been going on for a while, though it looked like something that was going to clearly take time to put into place. But it's just, with all the issues in the world, an interesting thing to focus on. But anyway, I guess my real question is, do you think that this type of technology, information weapon, in your words. Do you think it was intended for that from the start? And do you think that a pandemic crisis type thing was always intended to be the thing that was going to be the solution to the crazy problem of financial collapse that's been on the horizon, that's been held off for many years now? I know that's kind of a multifaceted question there.
Yeah, I know, but I get it. I know what you're asking, and the answer is yes, I do believe so. I think that, well, it's not that I think it. There's a good body of empirical evidence that the prevalence of infectious disease in a society correlates very highly with the emergence of authoritarian governments. Okay, and well, okay, so this academic research and the empirical data that they present, they kind of get it backwards, because they think that first there's an emergence of disease, and then for some reason the totalitarian government comes on top of it. They didn't present it as like the political forces that want to impose totalitarianism actually contrive these infectious diseases and make it seem like there's a prevalence of infectious disease in order to declare an emergency, which then enables them to work outside of the law and to say like, okay, well now, we're in great danger, and now, you can no longer go to work. We're going to shut down the schools. You cannot go to church. You cannot congregate. You have to socially distance. You have to do this, and this, all of which would be completely unacceptable to the people. And they would probably very quickly reject it, except when you scare the daylights out of them, because you tell them there's a deadly virus going around. And if you don't do all these things, everybody's going to die, or a large percentage of the population, which might include your loved ones, your friends, your relatives, your members of your family. So you have to do these things. And then at first, people are unprepared, and they can't quite imagine that they're being lied to about all this. So they take the situation seriously. And then to boot, they create the backdrop to convince you. So, as we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, they showed us a lot of big pictures of people in hazmat suits, people in reanimation, in hospitals being full of patients, in hallways, in everywhere.
Constant images of needles and the spike protein. Really weird.
It was nonstop. So you created this fear. And then, the existence of an invisible enemy that could be anywhere at any time, and it could be deadly to you and to your family, can justify declaring an emergency and doing away with civil liberties and the legitimate democratic process. And that then ushers a totalitarian form of government. So, that much is clear to me, that this was the intention. Now, to deceive people into believing that there's a pandemic, even if there isn't one, well, then I guess you have to think up convincing diagnostics. And so I do believe that at some point, they have all these think tanks that they spend hundreds of millions of dollars funding hundreds of think tanks around the world, where these researchers, academics, people with no real skills in life sit around and think through these scenarios, and then they think up how to solve problems like, how are you going to convince a population that there's a deadly pandemic around? Well, maybe we need,
like, really, is that
maybe
really your main
need
concern?
Yeah, maybe we need like some kind of a diagnostic technology that we could connect by internet and control everywhere around the world, but nobody can look into what it is. So I wouldn't exclude that the intent was there from the beginning. Even more so from the fact that they put Elizabeth Holmes to front this company. Because if you went to an experienced biochemist, to a highly reputed professor of medicine, that I think they wouldn't do this, because to them it would be an affront. It would be an insult to their intelligence to invest themselves, their reputation, their life's work into something that's clearly a fraud. So what you do is you get a young bimbo who is ambitious, who has no problem lying to people in front of a camera, and who is ready to advance to her goals over dead bodies. And they found that in Elizabeth Holmes. And so
she was a great fan of Steve Jobs too, right? Didn't she sort of want to be like him?
Yeah. She was a great fan of Steve Jobs. She tried to emulate him in many ways, except, Steve Jobs actually was a capable technology person. He was an inventor. He was a pioneer in computer technology and did create very impressive technology. Most people don't remember the Next operating system, but that was quite an impressive achievement that was his. It didn't work out as a business, but it was an impressive operating system. So she was a 19-year-old bimbo. I'm sorry to use that term, but that's how I perceive her. And so she was somebody who could be directed, who saw this as her way to greatness and riches without having to actually be an expert in anything, and who was ready to lie and steal and cheat to get to the goals that she was meant to achieve. And so
I just want to interject here that I'm going to link the video that you did on this topic, where you go into some detail about some experts who are around her who actually state this about their experience with her, that she didn't care about the facts.
Yeah. And
yeah.
I later found out, because at the time when I made that video, I didn't read John Carreira's book, because I wanted to publish it, and I thought it would take me too long to get through his book. But then I found the audio version, so I listened to it, and then in my video I said that it's very doubtful that she would have been able to convince real venture capitalist companies, because usually these serious venture capital investors will invest in a limited number of industries, right? Maybe biotechnology, or maybe internet, or maybe whatever it be.
Yeah, and they're going to hire consultants. I mean,
exactly. They will even retain specialists in these industries, so that they could vet potential investors, so that they could really understand what this technology is, how it works, whether it has a chance to succeed, whether it actually brings value to the market. So these would be normally extraordinarily knowledgeable specialists in their own field. And I thought, if some venture capitalist company invested in healthcare or biotech, they would have those experts on hand to vet Elizabeth Holmes's inventions and technology. And in fact, what John Carreira says is that she did go to such venture capitalist outfits, and in every single one where they conducted proper due diligence with industry specialists, they turned her down, which means that they very quickly identified that her whole story was hollow. And George Shultz should have been able to receive feedback from such meetings, to be privy to that information.
Yeah, so it makes you wonder where
General Mattis, Henry Kissinger, they all had ways and means to know all this. Yet they backed a thing that was very obviously a fraud. So
I mean, the money could have been filtered through them too, to be honest. It could have come from somewhere else and through them, like a DARPA type thing, or I don't know, some other entity. But
well, I believe
just
that
a thought.
I believe that the technology was probably developed, whatever technology they did develop, which was very flawed, very faulty, but it did do something. There was some hardware that was developed and designed. It did do something. They did conduct 15 different blood tests, not very well, not very reliably, but something was there. And I think that something was probably developed in that way, maybe with DARPA money, maybe with, who knows, Pentagon money in some way. But yeah, I think that you're right. You're right about that. That's very likely the truth.
So I mean, that's pretty scary if these kinds of plans have been there for so long, but there are other indicators of that as well, even though it's hard to accept. But do you see any factions? I mean, talk about Larry Ellis, enemy of Bill Gates kind of thing. Although I don't know, maybe when it comes down to money, they forget their differences. But you have Kissinger. There is a faction around Kissinger. Murdoch, who's kind of an enigma, especially since his own reporter was the one who he allowed to take this whole thing down when I assume he could have squashed it. Do you think that, and again, this is just one of my musings, my thoughts, do you think that it really was the whistleblowers who took them down, or is it possible that there was a factional war, that somebody else who wanted, who saw the opportunity, sort of epic opportunity for not just making money, but control and this and that? Do you think that it ended up being a factional war in the end that took down Theranos?
Well, it's very interesting that you should, I think you're onto something. And my answer is I don't know, but I did, it did cross my mind, because a lot of what came out started actually from a John Fuse lawsuit against Theranos. Okay, so there was this man, John Fuse, who was a medical doctor and an inventor. He developed certain technologies and started companies and sold them. So he was already a wealthy man, and he launched a lawsuit against Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes for some patent infringements, which actually he kind of filed a patent for a type of technology that he knew that Theranos would want to use. And that technology was for, I think, for communicating diagnostic information between servers through the internet, right? Because that's what, like what I mentioned to you, that
Right.
the analyzers kind of collected the blood and did some kind of analysis, but then the information, the data would be analyzed on the servers in Theranos headquarters, and then the results would be sent back to so he apparently then, when he understood what they were doing, he filed a patent for exactly this process of communicating diagnostic information over the internet. That's how I understood it. And so then when Theranos went ahead and started doing this, he said, like, aha, you're using my intellectual property. So he sued them. And so from that lawsuit came out a lot of leaks, and a lot of information came out. And it was John Fuse then who contacted Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreiro and started informing him about what was going on at Theranos. Well, the interesting thing about John Fuse is that not only was he a medical doctor and a businessman and an inventor, but he was also a CIA guy. So he used to work for the CIA. And so I thought that was incredibly interesting. And I wondered if, there was a very, how do you say, brazen thing to do to go against all these people, because, it was clear that, like, as I understood that Theranos had Henry Kissinger and General Mattis and Admiral Roughhead and George Shultz behind it. So did he. So how did he feel safe to go up against them and to jeopardize their precious baby? So I thought maybe there was a faction, in fact, and maybe he in some way was coming from a position of greater power than just an individual random businessman who had some intellectual property that he wanted to sue Theranos over. And then another reason why I thought there might have been a faction battle over this is because of the way Rupert Murdoch handled it. So Rupert Murdoch apparently is not above intervening in the editorial policy and decisions of his publications. However, in case of Theranos, even though Elizabeth Holmes implored him on 2 occasions to squash John Carreyr's story, he flat out declined, even though he was the largest investor in Theranos. So he invested $125 million of his own money into Theranos. And then when his own reporter's story was going to pretty much spell the end of that and make his investment worthless, he nevertheless didn't squash the story, which means that he was ready to flush $125 million down the toilet. He was ready to make all these very powerful people angry. And so I don't know what that's all about. We're not going to know, because I don't know how the information, how the plumbing of these power plays is arranged. But clearly there are things going on behind the stage, behind what we see. And it's not even excluded that there are some people who might be white hats in the whole story, that it's not, who maybe don't want their own children to be growing up in a Hunger Games world of the future.
Hope so.
So anyway. Maybe I mean, you can't exclude that there are some powerful people who want to do the right thing and who at a given moment do the right thing. And so I for a very, very long time, I had a distinctly negative impression about Rupert Murdoch. But this story, and then also the reporting of some of his television networks, particularly Sky News Australia, kind of gave me pause. And I thought, like, that's, his publications are clearly pushing back on this agenda. I don't know why, but I can't exclude that it's for the right reason. So, as you say, he's an enigma. He's an enigma to me too. I couldn't tell you more than what I already did. But it's one of those things that you say, like, okay, until I know more, I'll just kind of remain agnostic on whether I think Rupert Murdoch is a bad guy or not.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the frustrating thing about you collect all the information that you can, and over the years, you start to understand how these factions operate a little better anyway. And in 2016, it's almost like and since then, they've, I think, either decided to be more transparent, or these fights sort of broke out into the public, or maybe they felt they had enough control over things that they didn't have to hide things as much. But the factional battles became more visible, it seems to me. So I've become kind of a little obsessed with that, trying to understand these things that you can't prove them through any documents or anything like that, but you can sort of give your evidence.
No, but I think I agree with you, but it's, you know, like it's kind of discernible in principle, because when you want to consolidate control over a large system, over a whole society, over the economy, so what you have to do is you have to consolidate all the key sectors of the society, of the economy. And so what we've seen now is that in the last 50 years, the media space has gone from 50 or 60 corporations down to 5 or 6, right? The banking industry has consolidated to a great degree. You know, now you have the big 5 or 6 banks in the United States who hold the bulk of all the customer deposits. The industries have been consolidated. We see every day, everywhere, small and medium-sized businesses failing and large corporations taking over. But what happens in this process? Because now, you know, like you do this because it's much easier to control the reporting of 5 or 6 media corporations than it would be to control the reporting of 50 media corporations, right? You have to put pressure on 5 people essentially, or 5 board of directors,
Right, exactly.
or 5 editorial rooms, rather than 50 of them, which would be impossible. But at the same time, that dramatically fragilizes the system, because for the factions who want to push back, whether it be a rival faction in these high power plays, or like a populist movement, there's only five heads to behead, right?
Yeah.
Only 5 entities to behead, not 50. So they consolidate control, but at the same time they make their whole outfit that much more fragile. So
more vulnerable. Okay,
you know, even
yeah,
for the
thought
other
of it that
side,
way.
it's much easier for the other side to pressure from their side, because you know you can go to 5 boardrooms, five editorial rooms, and you can apply pressure in the same way that the other people are applying pressure, and then their whole agenda becomes that much more uncertain and that much easier to sabotage.
Yeah. Well, in this interest of time, I'll switch over to another topic, but I just want to encourage everybody to read this 3-part series of articles that Alex wrote, because we weren't able to give you everything that's in there. And I guess, do you also recommend the book by Carreras as well?
Well, actually, I do.
Okay.
I think it's a very, very good book. I normally avoid books written by journalists, because journalists tend to pack everything they have in chapter 1, and then everything else is just kind of fluff to fill up the pages. John Carrera's book, I have to say, is a very good read from start to finish. And so I didn't read it. I'm sorry, to clarify, I listened to it in audio, but I have to say he did a very, very good job. You know, and I do think that the way he wrote his book protects these power players. He's not outing them, but at the, you know, like, so he doesn't give you the perspective at the puppeteer level, but at the puppets level, he does a very good job of exposing the fraud. And then, you know, like, he gives you enough that you can kind of use your imagination to kind of imagine what the agenda might have been at the puppeteer level of the story.
All right, so I'll put links to all of those and in the show notes for people who want to dig into this a little further. But I did want to ask you, you had mentioned that the developments in the Russiagate story, the story that never dies, that you had some interesting insights on that. So I'd like to ask you about that, if you would.
Well, you know, there's a very small link between Theranos and Russiagate. It's not a real link, but it indicates that these swamp creatures, these power networks, they're all connected. And so I mentioned the law firm Boyce Schiller, who who were very proactive in aggressively intimidating and the potential whistleblowers and former employees and disgruntled employees of Theranos to discourage them from telling the truth about Theranos. One of the people who was involved with this, associated with the Boyce Schiller law firm, was I forget his name. I'm not going to be able to recall his name now. But then he went on and founded the CrowdStrike company. And CrowdStrike was central to Russiagate because, you know, they were the ones who analyzed DNC servers and said that it was the Russians who stole Hillary's emails.
Is this Dmitry Alperovich? Or let's see, the founder. I'm trying to think of his George Kurtz.
It might have been George Kurtz, but I'm really
Rick
not.
Marston. Okay.
It's I
can add it in.
dig that up. I could
later.
dig that up for you from my notes, but I'd rather not do it right now because we might be sitting in silence for 10 minutes.
Yeah. I'll just add it in later.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, you know, this is the indication of the same power networks where all these people are recruited into, and then, you know, like they go off on their assignments and do whatever is necessary to do to get the next agenda rolling. You know, one day they are conducting surveillance on Theranos employees, and then the next assignment is like start CrowdStrike and give us Russiagate, and so off they go and they do it. And so I don't think it's a random coincidence that the same person who was involved with the Theranos information repression, was also then involved in the Russiagate story. So anyway, that's just something I picked up in doing my research, but I didn't go farther into depth because ultimately it's irrelevant. You know, these things, they are what they are. Then,
well, it might not be irrelevant, and, you know, don't sell yourself short. I mean, Alex has done all kinds of research on Bill Browder, brought things between Alex and Lucy Commissar. I mean, we would never know any of the things that we know about Browder and that whole, I mean, he's part of the shadowy network as well. And so
yeah,
your instincts are already, and sort of your brain is already filled with facts about all of those things. So if anybody's going to see those kind of links, it's going to be someone like you,
right?
In my view. Now, I think we should probably switch over to the bonus question now, and I'd like to combine sort of two things into this. I want to talk about the Great Reset. I want to talk about something that's in your Grand Deception book about the historical signs of world wars, and sort of what kinds of things have preceded them in the past that are really not talked about. And I want to talk about your view of the empire, because I, for a long time, have had this sort of nagging feeling that the empire is not what it's being painted as. It's different than the way it is defined as the American empire. So let's talk about those things. This great, I think they're all connected enough to make this question coherent, even though it might not sound coherent at the moment. When we talk about it further, I hopefully you'll see what we mean by this. So let's talk about first, if you would, like, I'm worried, and I have been worried for a long time, that we are headed for a world war, an engineered world war, not just one that sort of naturally formed. I first started getting this sense, and it was vague because I just didn't know enough, after the coup in Ukraine and the just sort of rabid seemed sudden and rabid actions against Russia. And I thought, why are we doing this? Somebody seems to be drumming up a world war, and who would be crazy enough to do that? But what I've learned since then, I think you illustrated it pretty well in your in the historical analysis of how world wars start. And then hopefully we can talk about the Great Reset, because I think that's all part of it as well.
Yeah.
So if you could just ramble, if you would, on your thoughts on this whole thing and how it sort of fits together. I know it's such a broad topic, but if you could just sort of bring together some thoughts on that, I appreciate it. Visit aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can gain access to the bonus content, join the Discord community, and participate in the periodic Zoom calls where we talk among ourselves. I hope that some of you will join us, and now we'll continue with the wrap-up. So I'm going to roll over and back into the public part of this interview, and I just wanted to ask you, I have them here, I don't know if you have them in front of you, but to end on this positive note, would you mind going through or mind me reading the 6 lessons from your part 3 of your Theranos series? Because I think it applies across the board here to everything we talked about. And
sure.
They were very important.
Joanne, why don't you do it? Because I don't have it in front of me at the moment.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'll be happy to do that. All right. So number 1, don't be intimidated by great power. Number 2, a handful of courageous, principled individuals committed to justice and truth can defeat even the most powerful networks. Number 3, do not be too impressed with their technology. Number 4, they're stupid in a lot of ways. Number 5, and delusional. Number 5, resistance is never futile. And number 6, the truth is really important. And I don't know if you want to emphasize any points of any of those, but I just, again, I urge people to go read the longer version of that and listen to it and the video that Alex made about this. But, I appreciate that, particularly right now. And, a lot of people are really struggling. I've gone through some periods where I really struggled with this whole thing myself. So I can really appreciate what everybody's going through.
Yeah, and I think it's extremely important that we don't succumb to defeatism and pessimism, because there's no reason. This pandemic agenda is past its due date. It's past its peak, and I think that where this agenda is now is where Theranos may have been in 2014, when it looked unstoppable, invincible. But then, only several months later, it completely imploded like a house of cards. I wanted, I thought maybe I'd share my experience about technology, because this is maybe the most obscure aspect of those lessons to most people. So I spent many years in my career working on artificial intelligence applications and developing in systems engineering. And when they show you these technologies, these robots, these AI things, when they show you these videos of people walking down the street, and then the computer, boom, it identifies the faces, and you see little text, like it all looks very impressive. But don't think that these things work correctly. And developing such system is extremely difficult. It takes a lot of hard work. The process is painstaking and meticulous. I think that people maybe have. It's easy to believe that some genius programmer just writes the program, and then they hit run, and then the whole thing just runs.
Yeah, but data is messy. Data is messy inherently.
Yeah, it's not only data, it's that, writing code is extremely sensitive to to the process by which you do it. And it really depends on the quality of talent you employ. And so just to give you an example, if a software developer writes some, I don't know, some code today, and then you ask him to revise it 3 months later, very often they will struggle to understand what the hell they were trying to do.
Yeah.
Reading code is like it's a specialized skill. And so I don't write code, but I build models in Excel. And if you ask me to revise something that I've done last month or 2 months ago or 2 years ago, I think I'd rather have root canal done. It's hard. It's really hard. And one of the things that every software developer should do as they build their code, they have to document their code. This is geeky, obscure stuff to most people, but if you don't carefully, meticulously document the code you are writing, then you're not going to know what this code was for, what it was meant to do. And if you leave the project, become incapacitated, you change jobs, you die, whatever, and you have to put a new developer to continue developing and maintaining your code, it's a morass. And you can see this because 20, 30 years ago, the US, the Pentagon had this very, very ambitious plan to design an aircraft that would, for the next century, dominate the skies all around the world. And they came up with F-35. Well, F-35 is now, I think, something like 15 years overdue. They never finished it. They have flying planes, but they don't do. They're extremely poorly designed planes. They're nothing like what they intended to build, and the software that's meant to run those planes is a hopeless morass. So they can use them for very, very limited missions now. It's nothing like they hoped. So it doesn't matter how well funded you are. It doesn't matter how powerful you are. It doesn't matter how ambitious your objectives are. It's very, very difficult to build complex systems so that they're reliable, so that they're easy to maintain, because there's always the maintenance elements. It's not you just switch on a piece of software and then it runs flawlessly forever. It doesn't work that way. It's always maintenance heavy, and that maintenance depends on very, very highly qualified talent, which might or might not be there, which might or might not be able to do their work correctly for a variety of reasons. At any rate, they systematically try to impress us and intimidate us with all these technologies that they have coming our way, that they're going to control us, that we're not going to be able to escape from. Part of the reason why they do this is to make you think that resistance is futile. But believe me, most of those systems that they're trying to impress you with, by far, work about as well as those Theranos blood analyzers, meaning they barely work. And sometimes they even have to resort to computer graphics to produce those videos of robots that autonomously go around and shoot at targets. And a lot of those videos are not real. They're computer generated animations, right? And then people say like, oh my God, did you see those General Dynamics robots? I mean, those things are just going to be all over us. It's the Skynet. It's the Terminator thing. Those things don't work nearly as well as they're trying to project. So, they do walk, they do a lot of impressive things. As a systems engineer, I'm very impressed with those, don't get me wrong. But the idea that just they're going to patrol the streets and shoot you if you disobey, that's not going to happen. And then these very advanced pieces of technologies are always very, very vulnerable to low-tech things like a blanket.
Yeah.
Like throw a blanket over it, or
a battery.
So that's why I said don't be too impressed with their tech, because a lot of it is not nearly as dangerous to you as you think. So don't for a second think that resistance is futile. It's not. It's really not. So yeah. Anyway, I thought I'd share that because if you didn't have your fingers in actually doing that work of developing functioning system, it's hard to appreciate how extremely difficult it is to do that.
Right. Yeah, I concur. And I've done it for a lot of years as well.
Okay, then you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. If you would tell everybody where to find your work, your blog, and there may be people here who are interested in investments too. So make sure you mention your how to get in touch with you on the business side of
yeah,
things,
sure,
too.
sure. Okay, so I'm on Twitter at the Naked Hedgie, is the handle. Hedgie, like the hedge fund manager, the Naked Hedgie. Then I have a personal blog called the Naked Hedgie, where I publish these Theranos stories, but I also have a professional website called iSystem Trend Following, and I publish a daily newsletter covering generating real-time systematic trend following signals covering about 200 financial and commodities markets, which could be interesting to people who manage their own investments. The first month is always free of charge. It's like a test drive. So they can find more information about that on my website called iSystem Trend Following, or the address is isystem-tf.com. So that's basically my presence online.
All right. And again, I'll link everything in the show notes. And we only scratched the surface, so you have to promise to come back soon so we can talk more about this.
Yes, with great pleasure, Joanna.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Alex Krainer. Follow Alex on Twitter at Naked Hedgie, and find his work on his blog, The Naked Hedgie, and his professional website, iSystem Trend Following. You can find all the links in the show notes. This is a fully independent podcast, and in this age of censorship, your support is more important than ever. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com to find the various platforms, the ways you can find access to the bonus content and support the show. Also, it really helps if you like, share, subscribe, and leave reviews. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram, t.me/AroundTheEmpire. And we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.